Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and awesome.
I dig your heart, man. I see you're awesome as usual, right?
Thank you, thank you. You know, we are basically changing seasons, my friend, and we're going to be dressing differently from the way we were doing during the summer.
Interesting. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wider range of issues. But first, let's go to Ethiopia, where Ethiopians are still, I guess, jubilating or rejoicing, whatever you want to call it, about their Prime Minister winning a Nobel Peace Prize. I think it was awarded to him because of his efforts to achieve peace and bring about international cooperation between his neighboring country, Eritrea. Your thoughts, Shaka?
I think, Paul, you will agree that the man deserved it. You remember, whenever we would talk about Ethiopia, I would find time in which I could actually, someone would say campaign. But of course, at the end of the day, the views of the Nobel Peace Committee and the views of Ndugu Shaka seem to be on the same page.
I totally agree. I think for the longest time, every time we had a discussion on Ethiopia, you talked about how Abiy Ahmed has captured or has taken the country from a precipice of economic and political explosion to pretty much what everybody emulates on the continent. And you talked about the kind of reforms he's brought, talked about how he's trying to empower women, and on so many occasions, you talked about how you wished he could be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So now he has it. How do you feel?
I feel, first of all, vindicated that my views happen to be on the same page with the views of those ladies and gentlemen in Oslo. And he got it. Except, of course, there is a bit of politics when it comes to some of these very important awards, because one would have thought, especially if in fact Abiy Ahmed was given it for ending the 20-year-old war between his country, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, one would have thought that he could actually have shared it with Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea. Of course, there are some critics who would say that Isaias Afwerki does not deserve it because he happens to be democratically challenged. But you know, when you go back into the history of Nobel Peace Prizes, there are times when it has been given to some people with questionable credentials. For example, the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize, which was shared, I believe, between the great Madiba, Nelson Mandela, who eventually became president of South Africa in 1994, he shared it with the then president of apartheid South Africa, F.W. de Klerk. Would you say that that was fair?
Probably not, but under the context or the conversation that we're having, I can see the point that you're trying to make, simply because there are a lot of people who think that that should have been exactly the same thing, the right thing to do.
It takes two to tango.
Absolutely.
And in this particular case, if you talk about really helping to bring peace between two countries, between Addis Ababa and Asmara, then obviously logic would follow that the man in charge of Eritrea should have been a co-recipient of this particular award. And when you go to 19 73, I believe. You are talking about a man called Dr. Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State of the United States. He actually won that Nobel Peace Prize and co-shared it with the foreign minister of Vietnam. I think he was called Lee Doc-Tho, something of that sort. And Lee Doc-Tho is a very interesting man because he is admired for, in fact, having declined to receive it. But you can see, they got that Nobel Peace Prize because supposedly they had actually signed a peace agreement in Paris. But in fact, everybody who was watching that but Henry Kissinger ran away with the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh.
And Lee Doc-Tho said, you know what, there is no peace.
Yeah, what's the significance of winning this Nobel Peace Prize?
International recognition and respectability. There is no question that it is like money in the bank. It contributes sincerely to the perception of one's character and integrity. If you say something, it is like money in the bank. Have won it. They have gone on to do very respectable things and do that kind of stuff. So I think there was a bit of politics because let's face it, even when you look at the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to Anwar Sadat of Egypt, I mean, he shared it with two other individuals, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, and Perez, who now happens to be the President of the State of Israel, was then a foreign minister. They three shared that Nobel Peace Prize. But you know what? At that time, sincerely, even critics and observers wondered why the man who was the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House, Jimmy Carter, the man from Georgia, why he could not have been part of those who won, because in fact he is the one
who made it happen.
Who made it happen?
So it's
by hosting those individuals at Camp David.
Interesting. There are a lot of people who have said that, for example, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's reach transcends borders. For example, he has tried to bring about peace in Sudan. As we speak, he's negotiating the peace. He's part of the peace process in South Sudan.
Very true.
That perhaps that's one of the reasons why maybe this award could not have come at a better time. And
his domestic policy. I mean, he has literally, at least for now, changed or revolutionized, frankly, the politics of Ethiopia. I mean, look at the role of women in Ethiopia now. Very, very highly respectable. You have a president of Ethiopia who happens to be a lady.
You have Chief Justice.
You have the Chief Justice, and a greater percentage of the cabinet is made up of women. So in fact, when you look at the government of Ethiopia under Abiy Ahmed, it is like looking at a reflection of Ethiopia, which happens to be, of course, the second largest country in terms of population on the African continent after the land of the Ogas, Nigeria.
The last time I checked, I think there are about 109 million people.
109?
Yes.
The last time I saw was about 105 and what have you, but it's fine.
Yeah, but how about those critics who say that perhaps this award, maybe to Prime Minister Abiy, he was not deserving at all, because as we speak now, there are almost 3 million people who are internally displaced in Ethiopia as a result of the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia.
People will always find some reason, perhaps, in their own ways of finding out something that they think is not deserved. I mean, you remember there were a lot of, for example, critics who did not think that President Barack Hussein Obama deserved the Nobel Peace Prize that he won. And yet, let's face it, when you look at the man, you look at his policies, you look at the symbolism that you could probably cut really with a knife and all that kind of stuff. You look at the man that inspired a lot of young people and what have you, the man deserved it. And so you can't satisfy everybody. But let's face it, when you think about Abiy Ahmed sincerely, don't you think that when you look at some of the things that he has accomplished so far, both domestically in Ethiopia and the region, as you mentioned, of course, Sudan is where it is right now because of Abiy Ahmed. And you look at what he's also trying in Southern Sudan, and hopefully it will work. I think this is a man of all ages. You're talking about a man that, frankly, is probably legitimately somebody that you could actually call a new breed of African leaders.
Speaking about a new breed of African leaders, maybe let's switch the topic a little bit and let's talk about education. If we are talking about a new breed of African leaders, there is a report that just came out today, as a matter of fact, from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, talking about how the education standards on the continent are declining. They observed, or the report talks about the last 5 years, education standards have been declining, partly due to maybe people not getting the right skills, or people graduating and they don't have the right skills to compete. So if you're talking about this new breed of African leaders, how are we going to get that breed that we are talking about if we can't get the right people coming out of schools?
Who will be the future of Africa?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you have a point. But let's face it, by the way, the report you are talking about essentially is what you would call like an interim report, because the final report is not due until next year. So I think that when the report finally is out and we're able to read it and make some critical interpretations and stuff like that, we can talk more about that. But when you look at the continent, for example, evidence will show that the vast majority of the population on the African continent is very young. You're talking about 15 years and below. These are the people within the next 10 years who will begin moving into leadership positions, who will begin taking charge of the socio-economic political affairs of their respective countries. There's no question that African countries need to be concerned very, very much about the type of education that they provide to their young people. You remember about last month, I believe, we had a very interesting guest on Straight Talk Africa, a Dr. Lawrence Muganga. And the topic was rethinking education when it comes to Africa, because we're talking about an educational curriculum or system essentially that is archaic. The type of system that you and I went through. And in my particular case, I remember it was what you would probably call one size fits all. And I failed.
I don't think that has changed at all.
Failed.
Yeah.
I failed. If I hadn't actually somehow headed to the nearest political tall grass of the United States of America, I don't think that you and I would be here having a conversation, and this conversation being, in fact, in a sense, being seen and being this kind of dialogue actually being listened to on the African continent. Something is wrong. You have to be able to come up with a curriculum, first and foremost, that reflects the true social, economic, cultural, political realities of Africa. Africans need to be comfortable in their skins because at the end of the day, they ought to and they should be the giants on their own continent. But they cannot do that unless if they acquire necessary skills to help them navigate and negotiate their way towards harnessing, mobilizing and harnessing the resources and putting the young people and people who need jobs to work so that the economies can, at the end of the day, function in a sense that really finds that the people of Africa are first and foremost the beneficiaries of their own wealth.
Speaking of, let's go to Frank Nwamanya. What can easily bring about a unity if paid attention, or if the attention is only paid to African leaders? You're talking about young people here, but nobody seems to be focusing on young people. There are some young people who are doing extraordinary things out there, but the attention seems to be particularly on their leaders.
You are right.
Where does that leave the young people on the continent?
You are right, but we really have to be very, very careful, especially when we start comparing and contrasting Africa with other probably more developed societies and what have you. First of all, we have to look at the political infrastructure. When you talk about Africa, Africa is not open. Africa is pretty much closed. And Africa is pretty much run by certain authorities, certain individuals, until and unless there is what I would call a social cultural revolution of sorts, when the average African individual acquires the necessary information, the necessary knowledge, and this should not be asking somebody to get a Bachelor of Arts degree, a Master of Science or a PhD and whatever. But I'm talking about civic education. For somebody to know, for example, that they are citizens, and therefore they actually do have inalienable rights, birthright some would say, which grants them constitutional rights to be the giants, to make part of what I would call the primary, essentially what I would say, the primary stakeholders of their countries. To be able to know that they have the power and to be able to know that they can in fact mobilize and organize within the laws of their countries so that they can begin to make things happen. To know that they are the bosses at the end of the day of who they call the president, of who they call the prime minister, those who have parliamentary systems, the bosses of who they call ambassadors, judges or chief justices and whatever, that these are public servants serving their individual, because the way it is right now, you can talk and talk, but there isn't much you can do because society is controlled by these people who are supposed to be civil servants. But in fact, somebody has suggested they function in a manner that they should be probably characterized as quote-unquote evil servants.
Let me do a follow-up from Ibrahim Hami. Does it matter how long a leader is in power? I thought the question should be whether they are there by the will of the people they serve or not. Let me also do a quick follow-up. Over the weekend, I came across some chatter that was going on online, talking specifically about you and Straight Talk Africa. The last time you did a show on long-time serving leaders, the power of succession in Africa, you talked about how some of these leaders have overstayed their welcome. But there was one particular viewer who is a fan, who happens to be a fan, who challenged you. So, Shaka, you talk about these leaders who have been in power for a very long time, but you have also been a very long-time host of Straight Talk Africa, that you don't practice what you preach. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
You know, it is very interesting that you raised that issue. All I could say to this particular fan of mine, as you say, is that he really has it wrong. Because first of all, yes, I am a public servant. I am a public servant in the sense that I am a professional. I do not, for example, change constitutions. I do not have power that some of these rulers exercise. If they were leaders, in fact, they would not be violating their oath of office. Because, mind you, Paul, when some of these gentlemen or ladies run for political office and become presidents, guess what? They actually, they basically take an oath of office. And that oath involves, for example, when they were being sworn into office, of saying that, in fact, you have to protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution under which you come into office. Now, when you start getting into the business of shifting the political constitutional goalposts for personal and political reasons, really, then you are completely in a very uncharted territory. But when a guy like me, who happens to be a journalist, and I have a job description, just like the president has a job description of making sure that he or she defends and protects and preserves the Constitution, because that is the supreme, essentially, law of the land. He should be talking about the values of what they call, some people actually call it, essentially, the leaders really who do whatever is done on behalf of the people who put them in power. As a journalist, my job, interestingly, is to actually observe those who hold public office and make them accountable for their actions. And so the only way I can live Straight Talk Africa is if I become incompetent and my bosses feel that I no longer really have the confidence, for example, of the audience.
So in other words, you have no term limits?
I have no term limits. It's just that, for example, different countries have different, laws regarding retirement. The United States does have, but it's very, very generous. You can really retire any time, I think, from the time you have served in the neighborhood of 20 years and what have you, or when you are like 60 and above and what have you. But so long as you can still function professionally, so long as you are still remarkably articulate, so long as you still command integrity, you have character, and so long as you are still respected by your audience, you are in business. So you cannot really compare a journalist or a professor at a university or a teacher at high school or kindergarten with somebody that is a president of a country, that becomes a president because there has been an election. And this election has, by the way, to be an election that meets the democratic threshold, which means an election has to be free, fair, transparent, verifiable, and credible.
Let's go back to education. Let's go to Lily Paul. We need to be taught in our languages. See, China has developed. Everything is done in the whatever. Do you agree with that? Kindly thinks that maybe teaching young Africans in their languages maybe could help them. Is that something that you talked about, rethinking education? Is that something that can work?
Of course, you should use a language that is accessible by the people that you are trying to educate, to teach.
But even in the era of globalization, where you need actually speak more than one language to be able to be functional, can you?
You should be able to provide all those options. I think you talked about China. China is very interesting. China, the last time I checked, is not described as a democratic society. China is a socialist state. But China puts its people at the center. For example, I have seen statistics whereby China is one of those few countries where more than 20 million poor people have actually been liberated from poverty.
That is out of 2 billion,
that's a good thing.
That's like less than 0.01% of the population.
But one thing that you have to respect about China is that it has gone through phases. This particular phase that we are going through was actually put in place by a man called Deng Xiaoping, a man who said, for example, that he did not care about the color of the skin of the cat. All he cared about was whether the cat could catch a mouse. And therefore, basically what he decided to do was to borrow some values within democratic societies or capitalist societies in order to develop socialism. And as you know, China today, as we talk, happens to be sitting on the second largest Americans, for example, who happen to have the single largest economy, are indebted to China in very, very many ways. And so I think societies should be flexible. There is no shortcut to being in charge of your people until and unless you embrace democracy or a system that provides openness.
We'll leave it at leaders who are servant leaders. It's been a pleasure hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I look forward to next week. In the meantime, thank you so much.
You're most welcome, sir.